Hello all, Rick here doing a breakdown video on the California class Starship, introduced primarily as the main vessel of Star Trek Lower Decks. There's quite a bit to get into, so let's get into it. In real life, from the start, the design of the California class was to create a vessel that was not going to be a hero ship of Star Trek. The series was already settled to be a lighter comedy that would follow the crew of a ship that did not see prestigious assignments, and both the crew and the vessel itself were to be the unseen but necessary busy work that keeps the Federation running. The vessel was designed from scratch to match that premise, and retroactively slid into the continuity of the series to fit alongside vessels of the 24th century, around the TNG era and just after it. The two biggest influences into the design, therefore, were its contemporary Galaxy class, which would have been entering service at the same time, and the Miranda class, which was pretty much relegated to the workhorse role by this point in its life. The ship ended up incorporating design elements from the Galaxy class, but in a sort of stripped back and bare-bones fashion. The flair and design was taken away from the saucer section and the deflector dish, and what was left was a utilitarian look that appeared as if the design phase finished when its function was achieved. No bells, no frills, no grand impression. Even the pylons were left as basically their support frame encased in the hull. No smoothing or tapering necessary, and the same can be seen on the saucer section, where you can visibly see the individual decks at points instead of them being hidden within recessed windows or under a curving hull. The same goes for the nacelles, which follow this design aesthetic. Internally, it followed the design style of the TNG era vessels too, but again like a stripped back and bare-bones version of them, with squarer corridors and consoles, no wooden panelling, and harsher but functional lighting. The reason the class was called the California class was because the idea was to simply name the line after towns in California, be they large, small, or whatever, suggesting not all starships need illustrious legacies and names. The California class began being drawn up in the early 2360s as a vessel that was not to undertake exploratory missions nor patrol and defence, but the bureaucratic and logistic endeavours of Starfleet, while other vessels were created to delve into the unknown, establish contact with new civilizations, and expand the knowledge of the Federation of Planets. Some ships needed to be there to maintain and follow up in the footsteps of these high-profile missions. While there were ships such as the Miranda class and Excelsior that had long since fallen from their position as top-of-the-line starships, now fulfilling these roles, Starfleet still deigned to work on a new vessel specifically for this purpose. Such a craft would not need to operate beyond the known space, and it was not expected to encounter too many hazards, being primarily there to deposit engineering teams and engage in the construction and fabrication of new infrastructure. Such missions were usually in the ballpark of supply runs, colony establishments, and second contact. Second contact was basically when the Federation dispatched a vessel to continue the work set up after an official first contact, setting up communications lines to the Federation, introductions to aspects of the UFP, and so on. These missions were not particularly demanding in the traditional sense, with often scheduling and administration being the biggest tenets to adhere to, which honestly is way more relatable. In a pretty unique feature, the ships of the California class would be decorated in livery of the three departments, reflecting further specializations within the ship line, and this decoration often varied from vessel to vessel. Science-orientated ships would be there to provide medical relief and personnel, while Red Command ships would be more to deliver ambassadors and VIPs. By 2382, there were 32 California-class starships in existence operating throughout Federation space. Now, the engine room's position being so far from the saucer section was a design choice that not only gives the vessel a slightly ungainly look, but also a practical one in universe. The warp core system that the California used was rather large and powerful for its smaller bare-bones frame, Kind of like the Defiant was, however unlike the Defiant, which received all the time and care it needed and a specialised warp core, the Cali was a quicker and more slapdash job. The overpowered core therefore was placed further away from the main area of the ship in case of emergencies and instabilities while feeding straight into the nacelles. It looks like a vulnerability, but then again, this ship is not supposed to meet that many hazards. The scale of the California class seems a bit debatable, and several figures have been given by external sources from 794 metres long. A tweet in response to this query gave the length as 535.2 metres long and 121.3 tall, which seems accurate as to what was shown in comparison to other ships, which is surprisingly still larger than I thought, although you can clearly see that the saucer is 3 decks at the rim. It had 20 habitable decks from what I can find, although most of these, 13 of them, were located in the saucer section while the others were in the Star Drive engineering section. Only a couple were located within the long pylons, which were mostly empty, containing primarily the diagonal turbolifts for running between the two areas. There were no families on board, and its crew complement was around 300. The California class had a strong warp core, as mentioned, and a large engineering that exposed more of the core for maintenance than the Galaxy class. The core itself was located between the nacelles of the Star Drive section, which also housed the deflector dish array. However, despite its scale, it could only muster a velocity of warp 8, although it could exceed this, pushing slightly beyond, although the engine's stress was extreme and had to be shut down after a short time. At impulse speeds, the California was more manoeuvrable than its size suggested, giving it a reputation as a surprisingly nimble ship despite its slower speeds. With the strength of that warp core, it is curious as to why its warp factor was so low, but then again, in the 2360s, just pushing up against warp 9 is standard for Starfleet, with the Galaxy classes being capable of 9.6. In terms of armaments, it was fine, I guess. It had 4 phaser strips, which does not seem like a lot, but they were positioned to provide adequate coverage, and the 2 forward-facing photon torpedo launchers, with some versions having 2 rear-facing as well. Its deflector shielding was also decent and featured a rapid regeneration supplied by a dedicated isolinear core, making it tougher than it was dangerous. While not exactly capable of delivering a beating, it could certainly take one, and considering its crew mostly consisted of onboard engineers and scientists, while a lot of its damage could be repaired quicker than on other ships, a point of pride among teams on this class. Its secondary craft were located in the 2 shuttle bays, which covered 2 decks at the rear of the saucer and held around 8 shuttles. There was a 3rd bay on the drive section too. Californias that were expected to do a lot of groundwork often housed specialised shuttlecraft such as the Argos, which contained ground vehicles for deployment, and there was a captain's yacht below the saucer. In 2381, the USS Cerritos was taken in for refits after suffering damage, and the class was mostly unchanged, although it had some very minor cosmetic alterations and the addition of more visible torpedo launchers akin to the Sovereign overhauls, but nothing as extreme as Constitution class changes. This shows that the line really had no plans for major overhauls or upgrades, with additional systems only being added as a point of convenience during a needed refit. The California class overall is a perfectly fine vessel that does not stand out in any particular respect, except perhaps that it performs better than it was designed to with care and attention. The warp core in particular can be coaxed into behaving to live up to its full potential, and this pretty much sums up the class. At its best days, it can match ships beyond its class, but most of the time it just needs to coast by and get the job done on time. Reliability over exceptionalism. Without playing down the vital role these ships play, the biggest benefit they provide is freeing up the dedicated explorers to continue their explorations by picking up the slack in their footsteps. The Cali class is not the only such ship line to have this duty, but it is one of the few that was designed specifically for this role. And in that regard, yes, it stands at the head of its field. Thanks for watching this video breakdown of the California class, the not hero ships of lower decks. I've been Rick, and I'll see you again for another video. Until then, goodbye.